Marcus Ellison was 41 years old when the company he had built from nothing, the company that bore his name on 3 floors of a downtown Atlanta office building, had him escorted out of his own lobby by a security guard he had personally hired 6 years earlier. He had given that company 10 years. Not the polished, LinkedIn version of 10 years. Real years. Years of 5 a.m. calls with overseas suppliers. Years of missed dinners and rescheduled school plays and weekends that disappeared into spreadsheets and negotiations and conference calls that ran until midnight. He had taken a failing regional logistics firm and turned it into a 340-person operation with contracts in 11 states. He had done it the only way he knew how, quietly, methodically, one solved problem at a time. His wife Diane had watched all of it from the front row. What Marcus did not know, what he could not have imagined in the years he spent building that company, was that for the last 22 months, Diane and her father, Richard Holt, had been moving against him. Quietly, systematically, with a kind of patience that only comes from believing you will win. They had manipulated the board, forged records, and rewritten the founding documents of a company Marcus had bled to create, all while he sat across the dinner table from her and talked about their future. She had no idea that Marcus had kept everything. Every email, every wire transfer, every document stored, dated, and cataloged in a system she had never thought to look for, because she had never thought he was the kind of man who would look back. What happened next would cost Diane and her father everything they thought they had taken. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The alarm went off at 5:12 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, 14 months before Marcus would walk out of his own building for the last time. He was already half awake. He had been half awake since 4:30, running numbers in his head. A freight contract with a distribution partner in Memphis that he had been restructuring for the better part of 3 weeks. He sat up, killed the alarm before the second pulse, and swung his legs over the edge of the bed. Diane didn't move. She slept with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to tune him out long ago. He moved through the house without turning on the overhead lights. He knew the layout by feel, the slight rise in the hallway floor near the linen closet, the bathroom door that needed to be lifted slightly to close all the way, the third step from the bottom of the staircase that groaned if you stepped on the left side. He had bought this house 8 years ago, before the company had real money, before the contracts in Georgia and Tennessee and the Carolinas. He had paid cash for the repairs himself. Most of them. Replaced the water heater, refinished the hardwood floors in the front rooms, rebuilt the back deck with pressure-treated lumber he'd sourced himself, and carried in 2 trips in the bed of his 2014 Ford F-150. With a long scrape along the driver's side from a loading dock incident 4 years back that he'd never gotten around to fixing. He filled his thermos at the kitchen counter. Black coffee, no sugar, 3/4 full so it wouldn't slosh on the commute, and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the driveway. The F-150 sat under the orange glow of the street lamp, dark and patient. Beyond it, Diane's car. A new Mercedes, silver, purchased 3 months ago. She had mentioned it casually, the way she mentioned most things now, as a fact presented rather than a conversation offered. She had said it was a lease. He had not asked to see the paperwork. He had been not asking about a number of things for over a year. He pulled on his jacket, checked the inside pocket for his legal notebook, a thick, cloth-covered Leuchtturm he'd been carrying since his 2nd year running the company, the kind of habit so ingrained it was closer to ritual than routine, and walked out to the truck. The drive to the office took 22 minutes at that hour, which was the reason he left when he did. He used the quiet of the commute to work through whatever problem was sitting at the top of the pile. That morning it was the Memphis restructure. The contract had been misclassified at origination, a clerical error that had compounded over 18 months into a penalty exposure nobody had caught, until Marcus reviewed the file himself on a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks prior. He had flagged it, pulled the original agreement, and traced the misclassification back to a junior account manager who no longer worked for the company. He had written the correction memo himself and sent it to legal before 8 a.m. on Monday. That was how he ran things. Every problem got the same treatment. Find the root, trace it back, correct it completely. No shortcuts, no half measures. The company worked because he refused to let things sit. Ellison Logistics occupied floors 14, 15, and 16 of a steel and glass building on Peachtree Street. Marcus had chosen the building partly for the location, and partly because the floor-to-ceiling windows on the south side of the 15th floor gave him a clear sightline to the construction project, 3 blocks down, a mixed-use development he had been watching go up for 2 years, the kind of project that told you what a city thought of itself. He was at his desk by 5:48 a.m. His assistant Jerome wouldn't arrive until 8:00. The floor was his. He liked these 2 hours more than any other part of the workday. The silence of it. The clarity. He made a second pass through the Memphis file, confirmed his correction memo was watertight, and moved to the Tennessee expansion proposal that 2 of his senior directors had been developing for 6 weeks. He read it carefully, margin to margin. When he finished, he made 7 notes in the Luke term. 3 of them were problems that needed fixing before the proposal went to the board. He set the notebook on the corner of his desk and opened his calendar. The board meeting was in 11 days. He had built the board himself, 5 external directors he had recruited over 8 years, men and women whose judgment he trusted and whose presence gave the company credibility in rooms where his own name wasn't enough yet. He had been deliberate about every seat. He had never installed a director whose primary qualification was personal loyalty to him, because he believed that was how companies became brittle. He had not anticipated that the one seat he never controlled was the one that would be used against him. Richard Holt had come onto the board 3 years into the company's life, when Marcus and Diane had been married 2 years, and the company was just beginning to show what it could become. Diane had suggested it. Richard had the capital and the connections, she said, and he could open doors that Marcus couldn't reach on his own yet. Marcus had agreed because the logic was sound. Richard brought money and a network and an air of institutional credibility that had, in fact, opened several of the doors Diane had promised. What Marcus had not fully seen, what he had explained away for years as personality rather than agenda, was the particular way Richard looked at the company. Not as a vehicle Marcus had built and Richard had invested in, as a thing that existed in a space Richard's money had helped create, and therefore in a space where Richard's claim ran as deep as anyone's. "You're the operator," Richard had said once, at a dinner 2 years into their relationship, in a tone that had sat wrong in Marcus's stomach, and that he had let go, because letting it go was easier than examining what it meant. Operators need capital. That's the partnership. Marcus was the operator. He had not forgotten that sentence. Diane came from a different world than Marcus, not a richer one. Her family had been comfortable, not wealthy when she was growing up, but a world organized around different assumptions. Her father had always been the largest person in any room he entered, not because of his physical presence, but because of his certainty. He moved through professional life as if the positions he occupied had been created for him specifically. Entitlement was too simple a word for it. It was more like gravitational confidence. the unexamined belief that what was his because the universe had arranged things correctly. Diane had absorbed some of that. Not all of it. When Marcus had met her 11 years ago at an industry conference in Charlotte, she had been sharp and ambitious and genuinely curious about the work he was describing. She had asked good questions. She had understood the business instinctively. In the early years, she had been a real partner, not in the operational sense, but in the sense that she understood what he was building and why it mattered, and that understanding had been its own kind of company. Something had shifted over the past few years. It was hard to name the exact moment, because it hadn't been a moment. It had been a gradual reorientation, the way a house settles millimeter by millimeter until one day a door frame is visibly crooked, and you can't say when it happened. She had started spending more time with her father. She had started being present at board meetings in an advisory capacity, not formally, but in the way of a person who is establishing a pattern of presence before a pattern needs to be established. She had started talking about the company in the third person, not the first. What the company needs. Where the company should be going. Never what we built. Never what you built. He had noticed. He had told himself it was stress, or the season, or something in their marriage that needed attention he had not been giving it, because the Memphis restructure was unresolved, and the Tennessee proposal was consuming 2 senior directors, and the board meeting was in 11 days. He had been wrong about what he was noticing. The morning he found out happened on a Wednesday 43 days before the board meeting. He was in the copy room on the 14th floor, the small one, near the back corridor, not the main one near the executive suite. He had gone there himself, which he rarely did anymore, because he needed physical copies of 3 documents for a meeting later that afternoon, and Jerome was out sick. He was standing at the machine, waiting for the first document to finish, when he heard voices through the wall. The copy room shared a wall with one of the small conference rooms, the one usually used for vendor calls and informal check-ins. The ventilation system carried sound between the 2 spaces in a way that was not dramatic or cinematic. It was simply that the rooms were adjacent and the wall was not thick. Marcus had been aware of this acoustic quirk for years and had never thought much of it. He almost left before the voices resolved into words. The machine had finished, and he had picked up his documents and was turning for the door. He stopped. Not because he recognized the voices immediately, but because the specific rhythm of the conversation, its quietness, its compression, was not the rhythm of a vendor call or a check-in. It was the rhythm of people who did not want to be overheard. He stood still. Diane's voice, and her father's. Marcus will push back on the governance amendment. He always does when it comes to the equity provisions. Richard's voice, flat and certain. He won't have grounds. The amendment is legitimate. Chen already confirmed the language holds. A pause. He'll see it as a move against him. It is a move against him. Marcus did not move. He stood with the 3 documents in his hand and the machine warming behind him, and the ventilation running its quiet hum behind the walls. His breathing slowed. His hands remained steady. And the Harmon vote? Harmon is covered. He's been covered for 3 months. Richard's voice carried the specific texture of someone confirming a thing they had prepared carefully. Mitchell too, probably. The question is Chen. Chen will follow the documentation. He always does. Then we have the votes. Another pause. Longer this time. He built this, Dad. A silence. Then Richard. He operated it. There's a difference. Operators get bought out. That's the arrangement. Marcus stood at the door of the copy room for 11 full seconds. He counted them, without meaning to. The ventilation hummed. His documents were warm in his hand from the machine. He turned and walked back down the corridor and took the stairwell to the 15th floor, because he did not trust himself in an elevator with anyone he might have to speak to. He sat down at his desk. He opened his legal notebook to a fresh page. At the top, in his precise, unrushed handwriting, he wrote the date. He wrote the time. He wrote a single line: Governance Amendment. Harmon, covered. Mitchell, probably. Chen, documentation. He underlined the word covered. He sat for a moment looking at what he had written. Then he picked up his phone and opened his calendar and found the name he was looking for. A number he had never needed to call for himself, only for the company. Nathaniel Osei. Nathaniel had been a corporate attorney for 26 years. He had a reputation in Atlanta's business community that was not warm or particularly accessible, and was entirely accurate. He was the attorney you called when you needed someone who would not flinch, who would read the documents and tell you exactly what they said, and who had been doing this long enough to recognize when a sophisticated legal move was being made against an unsophisticated target. Marcus called him from the stairwell landing between 14 and 15, the one place in the building where no security camera had a sight line. Nathaniel answered on the second ring. "I need to understand a governance amendment that I believe is being prepared for my board meeting," Marcus said, "and I need you to tell me what I'm missing." A pause. "When's the meeting?" 43 days. "Come in tomorrow morning. Bring everything you have." Marcus came in the next morning with a leather folio and 2 years of company records organized in a sequence that Nathaniel, later, would describe as the most methodical evidence package he had received from a non-attorney client in his career. Financial statements, board minutes, equity dilution records, the original founding agreements, the amendment to those agreements from 3 years prior, the one that had seemed at the time like a standard governance update, and that Marcus had signed because Richard's attorney had called it standard, and because Marcus had been in the middle of a contract negotiation in Nashville and had trusted that assessment. Nathaniel read without speaking for 40 minutes. Marcus sat across the desk and did not check his phone. When Nathaniel looked up, his expression was not sympathetic. It was focused. "They've been building this for at least 18 months, he said. The governance language in the Year 3 amendment created a mechanism that, with the right board composition, can trigger a forced equity recapture. You would receive a buyout at a preset formula value, which, based on the formula they wrote, would significantly undervalue your position relative to current market." Marcus held still. "How significantly?" "Your stake, at current valuation, is somewhere in the range of 31 to 38 million, depending on which comparables you use. The formula gives you roughly 6.2 million. Marcus looked at the folio on the desk between them. "What do I need to do?" Nathaniel said. "You need to move carefully. And you need to move completely." Marcus moved carefully and completely. The first thing he did was nothing visible. For 2 weeks after the meeting with Nathaniel, he continued his routine without a single observable change. He arrived at 5:48. He reviewed files. He corrected problems. He attended the weekly leadership meeting and asked his usual questions and made his usual notes in the look term. He had dinner with Diane 3 times, and she mentioned a trip she wanted to take with her father in the spring, and he said that sounded good. He gave no indication of any kind that he had heard anything in the copy room. What he was doing, in the time that was not visible, was documentation. Every evening, after Diane was asleep, he would sit in his car in the driveway with his laptop and work through a different section of the company's records. He was looking for patterns. He found them. The equity dilution over the past 3 years, viewed as a sequence rather than a series of isolated amendments, told a coherent story. One with a destination. He photographed key documents with his phone, angles precise, document numbers clearly visible, forwarded them to a private email account Diane had no access to. He traced the amendment's language to a specific law firm, not the company's general counsel, a separate firm he had never retained. He cross-referenced that firm's client list with Richard Holt's other holdings. He found the thread in 11 days. The firm represented 3 of Richard's other corporate interests. It had drafted the Year 3 governance amendment. It had, based on email metadata from records Marcus located in the company's archived server files, been engaged by Richard 18 months before that amendment was executed, which placed the initial engagement at 14 months into Marcus and Diane's marriage. 14 months in. When everything had been good. When Marcus had been building the Tennessee contracts and the Memphis base of operations, and Diane had been asking smart questions, and Richard had been opening doors, Nathaniel reviewed the documentation over a weekend and called Marcus on Monday morning at 7:15. "I want to bring in a forensic accountant, someone who can testify to the timeline. Do you have the resources for this without touching any account your wife has access to?" Marcus had opened a separate account 13 days earlier. "Yes. Then we move, quietly and quickly. The board meeting is in 26 days. The account the forensic accountant would eventually present to the board showed something more complete than Marcus had found on his own. It showed that the equity dilution was not opportunistic. It was engineered. The Year 3 amendment had been drafted with specific language that created a trigger condition, and the board composition over the preceding 18 months had been quietly shifted toward that trigger. Harmon had been brought in as a replacement director when the original director, a man Marcus had recruited himself, had resigned under circumstances that now looked less like coincidence than choreography. His resignation had been preceded by 3 months of documented professional friction with Richard. Friction that had been kept off the official board minutes and that had been, as far as Marcus could tell from the archived emails, manufactured. The picture was complete. And it was damning. Marcus did not tell his brother Caleb what he had found until the 21st day before the board meeting, when the evidentiary documentation was fully assembled and there was nothing left to compile. They sat on the back deck of Marcus's father's house in Decatur, the cedar boards warm from the afternoon sun, and Marcus walked Caleb through the full timeline in the same flat, sequential way he walked through any complex problem. Caleb sat for a long time without speaking when Marcus finished. Then, "You knew, and you kept going to work. I needed the documentation complete before anyone knew I knew." Caleb put his hands on his knees. "Marcus, I know. She's been sitting at that table with you. I know. I want to." Caleb stopped himself. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to go with me to the board meeting. And I need you to not say a word until I'm done." "That's it?" "That's it." Caleb looked out at the yard, the old oak at the back fence line, the tomato plants their father had started, and that Marcus had been watering since their father's health had slipped. "You're going to walk in there knowing all of it." "Yes, and you're not going to say anything before." "No." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What does Nathaniel say?" "He says the documentation holds. He says if they proceed with the amendment, we can challenge the amendment, the board composition, and the fiduciary conduct of 3 directors in a single filing. And if they don't proceed?" Marcus picked up his coffee from the armrest of the Adirondack chair. It had gone cold. He didn't bother with it. "Then they've committed to a position they can't walk back without admitting what they built. Either way, they lose." The board meeting was on a Thursday at 10:00 a.m. on the 14th floor. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides and a long pale ash table with 12 chairs. Marcus arrived at 9:45. He arranged 3 document sets in precise stacks in front of the seat he always sat in, the one at the midpoint of the table's east side, where he could see both doors. He placed Nathaniel's business card on top of the center stack and left it face up. Nathaniel arrived at 9:52, nodded at Marcus, and took the seat immediately to Marcus's left. Caleb sat against the wall, behind Marcus, in the chair Marcus had asked Jerome to bring in from the smaller conference room 2 days earlier. The board filed in between 9:55 and 10:01. Richard Holt arrived with Diane at 9:58. He took his seat on the opposite side of the table with the specific ease of a man who believes the outcome has already been settled. Diane sat 2 chairs down from her father, on the same side, and did not look at Marcus when she sat. Marcus watched Richard open his leather binder and arrange his papers and settle himself with the particular composure of a man who is conducting a presentation, not attending one. At exactly 10:00, Marcus said, "I'd like to handle the governance amendment first, before we move to the agenda." Richard looked up. A brief beat. "The amendment wasn't. I'm aware it wasn't on the agenda," Marcus said. "But given that it's been in preparation for 18 months, I thought we'd give it the time it deserves." The room stilled. Marcus slid a document set to the center of the table. "What you have in front of you is a forensic account of the equity structure and board composition changes at this company over the past 3 years, prepared by a certified forensic accountant and reviewed by outside counsel." He slid a second set. "This is a timeline of the governance amendment's development, including the engagement records of the law firm that drafted it, and its relationship to 3 of Mr. Holt's other corporate entities." He slid the third set. "And this is a preliminary filing notice from Nathaniel Osai, who is sitting to my left, indicating our intention to pursue a claim of breach of fiduciary duty against 3 current board members, pending the outcome of this meeting." Richard's hand went flat on the table. Harmon, at the far end, did not move. His face went the color of old concrete. Diane had not looked at Marcus once. She was looking at the documents in front of her father, with an expression that was not guilt and was not quite surprise. It was closer to the look of someone who has watched a careful structure begin to come apart and cannot yet believe the speed of it. "The amendment," Marcus said, "was designed to trigger a forced equity recapture at a formula valuation of approximately $6. $2 million for my stake in this company. A stake that independent comparables place between $31 and $38 million. This was not an error. It was the purpose of the amendment." He looked at Richard. "And you built it from the inside of a marriage." Richard's jaw tightened. He looked at Nathaniel. "This is a transparent attempt to, Mr. Holt," Nathaniel said. "Without particular force, you can speak with your attorney. That would be my recommendation." "I don't need." "You do," Nathaniel said. "You will." Diane finally looked at Marcus. It was a brief look, less than 2 seconds. He had prepared himself for what he might feel in that moment. Anger or grief, or something that had not resolved itself into a name yet. What he felt was very little. The documentation was real. The timeline was real. The look on her face was not regret at what she had done. It was regret that it had not worked. These were different things, and the difference mattered. Marcus stood. He adjusted his jacket. He picked up the Leuchtturm from the table. He had brought it out of habit, the way he always brought it to board meetings. And he held it at his side. He looked at the directors in turn. Harmon, Mitchell, Chen. The 2 independent directors who had received the document package by courier the previous afternoon, and who were, based on their expressions, beginning to understand the full shape of what they had been positioned inside. "I built this company," Marcus said. "I built it from a failing regional operation into what you're all sitting inside right now. I did it without shortcuts and without leveraging relationships I didn't earn." He paused. "You calculated that I wouldn't fight, that I was too grateful, or too trusting, or too dependent on what you could take from me to do anything about it when you moved." He looked at Richard. Then at Diane. "You were wrong about what kind of man I am. And you were wrong about how carefully I keep records." He walked out. He did not look back at the table. He did not wait in the corridor. He took the elevator to the lobby, nodded at the security desk, and walked out onto Peachtree Street, into the late morning light. Caleb was at his shoulder by the time they reached the sidewalk. He didn't say anything. They walked half a block to where Marcus had parked the F-150, and Marcus unlocked it, and they both got in, and Marcus sat with his hands on the wheel for a moment, with the engine off, listening to the city noise and the distant sound of the construction project 3 blocks down. He started the truck. What followed was not fast. Justice, in Marcus's experience, was not fast. It was meticulous, which was something else. Nathaniel filed the formal challenge within 4 business days of the board meeting. The forensic accounting report became central to a civil claim that expanded as discovery proceeded, to include wire fraud allegations connected to the law firm's engagement predating the amendment's execution. The 3 targeted directors, Harmon, Mitchell, and the arrangement with Chen that was, on examination, less definitive than Richard had believed, each responded differently to the discovery documents. Harmon retained his own attorney within 48 hours of receiving the formal filing. Mitchell called Nathaniel's office directly, without counsel, which Nathaniel described as not something I'm able to advise you to do, for reasons that should be obvious. Chen produced internal communications from his own records, emails from Richard over an 18-month period, that filled in 3 gaps the forensic account had not been able to close. The settlement conference took place 6 months after the board meeting, in a glass and steel building 12 blocks from Peachtree Street. Marcus arrived precisely on time. He helped Nathaniel arrange documents in precise stacks on the conference table. He helped himself to water from the credenza and took his seat and sat with the log term open to a fresh page and a pen in his hand, and nothing in his expression that said anything about what was coming. Richard and his attorney arrived 8 minutes late. Richard's color was not good. He had aged, visibly, in 6 months, not from grief, but from the specific exhaustion of a man who has spent 6 months watching a structure he believed was permanent come apart one document at a time. Diane was not present at the settlement conference. She and Marcus had formally separated 4 months earlier. The divorce proceedings were being handled by attorneys, as these things are. She had called him once in the 2nd month, on a Tuesday evening when he was at his father's house. He had let it go to voicemail. She had not left a message. The settlement, when it was reached, was not a small number. Marcus's stake in the company, at a valuation established through the litigation process rather than the formula Richard had written, settled at $34.5 million. The civil fraud claims against Richard's associated entities contributed a further judgment that Nathaniel described, without elaboration, as adequate. The 3 directors separated from the board in a sequence, and with a speed that, in the world of corporate governance, would be understood by anyone who knew what to look for. The company continued. It was not Marcus's company anymore, in the sense that his name was no longer on the operating agreements. It was his in the sense that everything inside it, the Memphis restructure, the Tennessee contracts, the 340 people who showed up every morning and did the work, had been built from his 5 a.m. phone calls and his orange chalk and his precise notes in the margins of every document that mattered. Operators run what founders build, Marcus had thought, in the copy room, standing with his documents warm from the machine. He had understood, in that moment, what Richard had miscalculated. Richard had looked at Marcus and seen the operation. He had not looked long enough to see what was underneath it. Because I looked at it long enough. Marcus spent the first month after the settlement doing very little. He helped his father's tomato plants into the season. He drove the F-150 with no particular urgency and no particular destination. He spent an afternoon rebuilding the gate at the back of the property. The latch had been loose for 2 years and needed to be reset properly, which required taking the gate off its hinges and starting from the frame. He did it methodically, piece by piece, until the gate was level and the latch caught clean. He had purchased a property the previous year, a commercial building in Buckhead that he had been considering for a different purpose entirely when he bought it, but that now, having the time to think about it, seemed right for something else. He was thinking about starting something smaller than what he had built. Something he could grow from the inside. Something where every agreement bore his name from the beginning, and no amendment could be written into the structure by someone who had been looking, not at what he built, but at the space where they thought they could fit instead. He sat on the back porch of his father's house on a Saturday afternoon in October, the cedar boards warm from the sun, the tomato plants done for the year. He had coffee in a thermos and his Locaterm open to a page he had been filling for the past hour. Not problems and their corrections, but the outline of something new. Nathaniel had reviewed the basic framework and called it sound. Caleb had offered to come in when the time was right. The gate at the back of the yard hung straight in the frame, the latch catching clean in the September air that had finally begun to turn. He did not look at what was behind him. There was nothing back there that required him to look. The work was in front of him, the page, the building in Buckhead, the outline of what he would build next. He was 41 years old. He had built a $34 million company from nothing, and he knew, in the specific way that a person who has done something once knows it, exactly how it was done. He picked up his pen. He started at the top of a fresh page. He did not rush. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.